The road begins where the pavement ends. If you look at a map of western South Dakota, you will see a thin gray line that runs from nowhere to nowhere, a dashed thread stitched through the heart of the Badlands. Most people miss it. They speed along Interstate 90, watching the jagged spires and striped buttes roll past the window, thinking they have seen the Badlands, but they have not. They have only seen the postcard version, the preserved slice of wilderness inside the national park. The real Badlands, the ones that stretch for hundreds of square miles beyond the fences, hold secrets that no postcard can capture. And running through the middle of those secret lands is a highway that time forgot. I first heard about it from an old man in a gas station in Wall, South Dakota. Wall is famous for its drugstore, a sprawling tourist trap where you can buy jackalope mounts and t-shirts that say "Where the hell is Wall?" But on a quiet Tuesday afternoon in October, the drugstore was nearly empty, and I was the only customer pumping gas. The man behind the counter wore a faded cowboy hat and a denim jacket that had seen better decades. He watched me with the patient curiosity of someone who had nothing else to do. When I asked him about the back roads, he nodded slowly and said, "You want the old highway, the one nobody drives anymore." He told me about a two-lane blacktop that splits off from the main road near the town of Interior. It was built in the 1920s, he said, back when the Badlands were still being explored and pioneers were scratching out homesteads on the hard dirt. The highway was supposed to connect the scattered settlements, to bring mail and supplies and hope. For a few decades, it worked. Trucks rattled over the washboard gravel, farmers hauled their grain, families drove into town for church on Sunday. But then the interstate came and the old highway became a relic. The pavement cracked, the signs fell down, and the weeds crept in. By the 1970s, it was barely a road at all. Today, he said, you could drive it from end to end and not see another car. Most maps do not even list it. That was enough to make me want to find it. I drove south from Wall under a sky the color of old denim, past the turnoff for the national park, past the little cluster of houses that call themselves Interior. A few miles later, I found a junction where the asphalt turned to gray concrete and then to gravel. There was no sign, just a rusted stop sign tilted at a drunken angle. The road ahead disappeared into a fold of hills. I pulled over and got out to look. The silence was absolute. No wind, no birds, no distant hum of traffic, just the sound of my own breathing and the dry creak of my boots on the dirt. The Badlands rose around me like the ruins of a lost civilization, red and white and orange bands of rock stacked high against the blue. This was the entrance to the forgotten highway. The highway has no official name. Locals call it the Old Gap Road, or sometimes the Scenic Route, though there is nothing scenic about the way the concrete crumbles into the ruts. It runs roughly east to west, cutting across the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation before petering out somewhere near the White River. The entire length is about 60 miles, but those 60 miles feel like a journey across a different planet. The land is raw and exposed, sculpted by wind and water into shapes that defy logic. There are spires that look like cathedral towers, ridges that resemble the spines of buried dinosaurs, and depressions so deep and dark you expect to find bones at the bottom. The highway follows the contours of the land, ducking into draws and climbing over saddles, never in a straight line for more than a quarter mile. I started driving just before noon. The gravel was loose and the car fishtailed on the corners. I kept the windows down, letting the smell of sage and dust fill the cab. For the first few miles, the road was passable, if rough. I passed a few abandoned homesteads, wooden houses with roofs caved in and doors hanging open. One had a sign, faded almost to nothing, that read Gottlieb Ranch 1920. The windows were dark and empty. I imagined a family living there, a man named Gottlieb and his wife and children, scratching a living from the thin soil. They would have driven this road to town, maybe once a week, the children bouncing in the back of a wagon. They would have watched the seasons change, the prairie fires in summer, the blizzards in winter. Now all that remained were a few boards and a memory. The road climbed up onto a plateau, and the view opened wide. To the north, I could see the White River Valley, a green ribbon winding through the brown. To the south, the Badlands stretched to the horizon, layer upon layer of rock and clay, like a book of Earth's history left open to the wind. The highway was a narrow scar across that book. In places, the pavement had buckled and split, and young cottonwoods had taken root in the cracks. I had to swerve around a boulder that had tumbled from the cliff above. It was obvious that no road crew had been here in years. This was a road that was slowly returning to the earth. I stopped at the top of the plateau and turned off the engine. The silence returned, deeper than before. I got out and walked to the edge of the road, where the gravel gave way to bare rock. The wind picked up, warm and dry, carrying the faint smell of rain far away. I looked down the road ahead and saw it winding into a canyon, the walls rising on either side. The sun was high, casting sharp shadows that made the landscape look even more alien. I thought about the people who had built this road. They had come here with picks and shovels and dynamite, blasting through the rock to lay a path across the wilderness. They had worked in the heat and the dust, probably for wages that barely kept them alive. They had built something that was meant to last. But the Badlands do not care about human intentions. They erode everything in time. As I stood there, a memory came back to me. When I was a kid, my grandfather used to tell me about a road trip he took in the 1950s. He and his brother drove from Chicago to California on old Route 66, but they took a detour through the Badlands on a road he called the Goat Trail. He said it was the most beautiful and terrifying drive of his life. The road was so narrow that the wheels of the car hung over the edge of a cliff in places. The brakes got so hot they started smoking. They stopped at a little store run by a Lakota woman who sold fry bread and coffee. He never forgot the taste of that coffee, he said, bitter and strong with the smell of sage on the wind. I asked him what the road was called, but he could not remember. He just called it the old highway. I think I found it. I think I found the Goat Trail. The canyon ahead was deep and narrow, with walls of layered sandstone and clay. The road descended sharply, switchbacking down the slope. I drove slowly, my hands tight on the wheel. The gravel gave way to dirt, and the dirt gave way to bare rock. The car bottomed out once, scraping the undercarriage. I stopped and got out to check the clearance. The road was barely wide enough for one vehicle. If I met another car, I would have to reverse for a mile to find a place to pull over. But I was not worried. The old man at the gas station had told me that in the past 10 years, he had only seen 2 other cars on this road. One was a rancher checking fence lines. The other was a geology student from Colorado. I was alone. The canyon walls rose 100 feet above me, striped with colors that seemed to glow in the afternoon light: red, orange, white, yellow, and a deep purple near the base. Each layer was a different chapter in the Earth's story, a record of ancient seas and rivers and volcanic ash. The road followed the canyon floor, crossing a dry creek bed every few hundred yards. The creek was nothing but sand and stones, but there were signs of water, a patch of green grass, the muddy prints of a deer. I drove with the windows down, listening to the sounds of the canyon, the crunch of tires on gravel, the hiss of the wind, the occasional clatter of a rock tumbling from the rim. Around the third bend, I saw something that made me stop. A structure stood at the edge of the road, half hidden behind a wall of brush. It was a stone building, low and square, with a roof that had partially collapsed. The walls were made of rough-hewn blocks of the same sandstone that formed the canyon. I parked and walked over. The brush was thick, and I had to push through branches that scratched my arms. The building had no door, just a gaping black opening. I stepped inside. It took a moment for my eyes to adjust. The interior was dim, lit only by the light that filtered through holes in the roof. The walls were covered in graffiti, names and dates carved into the stone. The oldest I could read was from 1926. Someone had scratched B. Johnson, April 1926, with a heart and an arrow. There was a fireplace in the corner, the stone blackened with soot. A piece of charred wood lay on the hearth. The floor was dirt, packed hard by years of footsteps. I imagined this place as a rest stop for travelers on the old highway, a place to get out of the wind and brew a pot of coffee. 50 years ago, a family might have stopped here, the children running around while the parents stretched their legs. Now it was just a ruin, forgotten like the road itself. I sat down on a fallen rock and looked around. The silence was heavy, but it was not empty. It was filled with the presence of the past, the echoes of voices long gone. I thought about B. Johnson, whoever he was. He had stopped here in April 1926, maybe on his way to a new life out west. He had carved his name and a heart into the stone, a small claim to permanence in a place that would erase him. I wondered if he ever came back. I wondered if he lived to be old, or if he died young in some other forgotten corner of the world. The Badlands do not tell you the stories. They just let you wonder. Outside, the sun was beginning to angle toward the west. The shadows grew longer, and the colors of the rock deepened. I knew I should keep moving if I wanted to reach the end of the highway before dark. The old man had warned me that the last 10 miles were the worst, a stretch of road that had not been maintained since the 70s. He said the washouts could swallow a car whole. I got back in my vehicle and started the engine. The road ahead was a narrow ribbon of dirt winding through the canyon. I took a deep breath and pressed the gas. The canyon widened after a mile, and the road began to climb again. The switchbacks were tight and the incline was steep. My car groaned in low gear, the tires spinning on loose gravel. I kept my eyes on the road, not looking at the drop on my left. The cliff fell away into a deep ravine, the bottom lost in shadow. I could feel the heat coming off the engine, and I hoped the brakes would hold. The road was no longer just forgotten. It was dangerous. At the top of the climb, the land opened into a wide basin. The highway leveled out and ran straight across the valley floor. And there, in the middle of nowhere, I saw a sign. It was old, leaning to one side, with faded blue letters on a white background. It said, White River 22 miles. Scenic overlook ahead. The arrow pointed to a dirt track that branched off to the right. I took it. The track led to a small parking area at the edge of a cliff. I parked and got out, and the view made me stop breathing. The overlook was a natural balcony perched on the rim of the Badlands. Below, the landscape fell away into a labyrinth of canyons and buttes, stretching for miles in every direction. The late sun painted everything in gold and amber, turning the rocks into fire. In the distance, I could see the White River, a silver thread winding through the valley, and there, faint on the horizon, was a line of green trees that marked the path of the forgotten highway. I could trace it with my eyes, a faint scar across the land. It went on, disappearing into the haze. I stood there for a long time, watching the light change. The wind picked up, cool now, carrying the scent of evening. I thought about all the people who had driven this road, the ones who had built it, the ones who had lived along it, the ones who had left their names on stone walls. They were all gone now, but the road remained, slowly crumbling. In another 50 years, it might be gone too, washed away by a storm, buried by a landslide, reclaimed by the grass. But for now, it was still here, waiting for anyone brave enough to drive it. I got back in the car and continued east toward the White River. The sun was dropping fast, and I still had miles to go. The road grew rougher, the washouts deeper. I had to stop twice to clear rocks from the path. The sky turned orange and then purple, and the first stars appeared. I drove with the headlights on, following the faint glow of the dirt. And then, without warning, the road ended. The gravel simply stopped at the edge of a steep embankment. Beyond it, a paved road ran north and south, modern and smooth. I had reached the other side. I pulled over and sat in the dark, engine idling. The forgotten highway had delivered me to a place that looked like any other stretch of South Dakota blacktop. A car passed, its headlights sweeping over me, and then it was gone. The driver probably did not notice the gravel track I had come from. He did not know that behind him, a road through the Badlands was slowly fading into memory. But I knew, and as I sat there, I made a promise to myself. I would come back, I would drive it again, from end to end, before it disappeared for good. I sat there for a long time, the engine idling, the headlights cutting a tunnel through the darkness. The paved road in front of me was empty, a straight line running north toward the lights of a distant town and south into the blackness. The forgotten highway had ended, but I felt no sense of arrival. I felt only a quiet sorrow, the kind that comes when you leave a place that has just begun to speak to you. The promise I made to myself lingered in the air like the last note of a song. I would come back, but first I needed to understand what I had just driven through. I pulled out the map the old man at the gas station had given me. It was a photocopy of a photocopy, the ink faded, the paper soft and yellowed. He had drawn a line in red marker, the route I was supposed to follow. But now, sitting at the end of that line, I realized the map was more than directions. It was a record of a world that no longer existed. The towns marked on it were gone. The highway itself was barely visible on the paper, a thin red line that ended where the modern road began. I folded it carefully and put it in my pocket. Then I turned the car around. I did not want to leave the Badlands just yet. The night was clear, and the stars were coming out in numbers I had forgotten were possible. I killed the engine and stepped out. The air was cool and dry, carrying the faint smell of sage and dust. I stood in the middle of the paved road, surrounded by darkness, and looked up. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like a river of light, so bright and dense that it seemed close enough to touch. It was easy to understand why the Lakota people called this place Mako Sika, land bad and also sacred. There was something overwhelming about the vastness, the way the earth fell away and the sky took over. I walked back to the gravel track and followed it 100 yards until the modern road was out of sight. The forgotten highway was still there, quiet and waiting. I knelt down and touched the gravel. It was rough and cold, the stones worn smooth by decades of traffic. I wondered how many tires had passed over the same spot. Farmers hauling wheat, families moving west, salesmen in their Ford Model Ts, soldiers coming home from war. Each one left a faint impression. A grain of dust shifted, a pebble pressed deeper into the earth, and then the road was abandoned and the wind and rain began their long work of erasure. I thought about the people who had lived along this road when it was new, the homesteaders who built their houses out of sod and hope, the ranchers who drove cattle across the open range, the merchants who set up general stores at the crossroads, selling canned beans and calico fabric and boots that would last a year. They had believed in this road. They had petitioned the county, the state, the federal government, asking for a highway that would connect them to the rest of the nation. And finally, they got it. The highway brought mail and newspapers and strangers. It brought change, and then just as quickly it brought the interstate and the road became obsolete. The towns dried up, the stores closed, the people left. All that remained was the gravel and the ghosts. I walked back to the car and drove into the nearest town, a place called White River that was little more than a gas station and a diner. The diner was still open, a neon sign buzzing in the window. I went inside. The air smelled of coffee and frying bacon. A few old men sat at the counter, nursing cups of coffee and talking in low voices. The waitress was a woman in her 60s, her hair silver, her apron stained. She looked up when I came in and gave me a tired smile. "Late traveler," she said. "You look like you've been driving the old road." I nodded. "How did you know?" She laughed. "Nobody comes through here at this hour unless they done something foolish, and that road is the only foolish thing left around these parts." She poured me a cup of coffee without asking. "What did you see out there?" I sat down and wrapped my hands around the warm mug. I saw a lot of sky. I saw a stone building with names carved into the walls from 1926. I saw a sign for a scenic overlook that probably nobody visits anymore. She nodded slowly. That building was a stagecoach stop back in the day. The old-timers called it Johnson's Rest, built by a man named Benjamin Johnson. He came out from Iowa in 1910, trying his luck at homesteading. He built that stone shelter with his own hands, using rocks he hauled from the canyon. He ran a little store there, sold eggs and flour and kerosene to travelers. The highway came through in the 20s and business boomed. He added a room in the back, rented it out to folks who got caught out after dark. My grandmother used to tell me about him. She said he had a voice like gravel and a heart as big as the Badlands. "What happened to him?" I asked. She shrugged. "He got old. The highway got rerouted. He stayed on for a while, but the customers stopped coming. He died in the early 60s, alone in that same stone room he built. They found him 3 days later. The town buried him out on the prairie, somewhere north of here. Nobody knows exactly where. His grave is probably gone by now." I sipped my coffee and thought about B. Johnson, the man who had carved his name and a heart into the wall. He had been a real person, with hands that bled from hauling rocks and a heart that hoped for love. The heart he carved might have been for a woman or for the land itself. I would never know. But the fact that he existed, that he lived and died in that lonely canyon, gave the road a weight it had not had before. The waitress leaned on the counter. "You planning on going back?" she asked. I looked up. I made a promise to myself that I would. "Good," she said. "That road needs someone to remember it. Every year there is less of it. The last big storm took out a bridge about 6 miles west of here. The county says they are not going to fix it, so if you want to drive it again, you better do it soon. That bridge was the only way across the White River in that stretch. Once it goes, the road is cut in half." I asked her where the bridge was. She gave me directions, and then she said, "If you go tomorrow, take some water and a shovel. You never know what you might find." I paid for my coffee and left. The night was colder now, the temperature dropping into the 40s. I slept in the car, curled up in the back seat, my jacket pulled over my head. I dreamed of the Badlands. I dreamed of driving through a canyon where the walls were made of glass and the road was paved with old letters. I woke up at dawn, stiff and hungry, but eager to see the bridge the waitress had mentioned. I drove east on the modern highway for a few miles, then turned onto a gravel road that ran parallel to the White River. The morning light was soft and golden, and the river sparkled through the trees. The gravel road was in better condition than the forgotten highway, but it still had its share of potholes and washboard sections. I followed it for about 10 miles until I saw the bridge ahead. It was a steel truss bridge, painted a peeling shade of green, 1 lane wide. The deck was concrete, but there were holes in it, and the railings were twisted and broken on one side. I parked and walked out onto the bridge. The river was maybe 50 feet below, running clear and shallow over a bed of smooth stones. The bridge groaned under my weight. I could see where the storm had damaged the supports, the concrete cracked and the rebar exposed. The waitress was right. Given enough time, this bridge would fall. And when it did, the last connection between the two halves of the forgotten highway would be lost. I stood on the bridge for a long time, looking downstream. The river curved around a bend, and beyond it, I could see the faint line of the old road climbing out of the valley. It was still there, waiting. But the bridge was the only way to reach it from this side. I wondered if I should try to drive across. The bridge looked unstable, but the morning was calm and the car was light. I walked back and forth, testing the concrete with my feet. The edges crumbled, but the center seemed solid. I decided to risk it. I drove onto the bridge slowly, keeping the car in first gear. The wheels hummed on the concrete. I looked down through the holes and saw the river moving beneath me. My heart beat faster. Halfway across, I heard a loud crack and the car lurched to the side. I stopped. I got out and examined the right rear wheel. It had dropped into a depression in the concrete, a shallow crater filled with gravel and debris. The wheel was wedged and the car was tilted. I tried to rock it back and forth, but it did not budge. I was stuck right in the middle of a dying bridge over the White River. I took a deep breath. The waitress had told me to bring a shovel. I had one in the trunk. I grabbed it and started digging around the wheel, trying to free it. The gravel was loose and I made progress quickly. After 10 minutes, the wheel was clear. I got back in the car and eased forward. The car rolled out of the hole and off the bridge. I did not look back. I just kept driving until I was on solid ground again. I pulled over at the edge of the road, my hands shaking. Bridge sagged behind me, a monument to the futility of repair. I had made it across, but barely. I knew that if I ever came back, the bridge might be gone entirely. The road ahead was a narrow track winding through sagebrush and juniper. I followed it for another few miles, climbing steadily. The valley opened up, and I saw the Badlands again, this time from a different angle. The rock formations looked like ancient castles, their towers rising against the blue sky. The road turned to dirt and then to sand. I had to stop and let air out of my tires to get traction. The sand was soft and deep, and the car slid sideways. I kept the speed up, not daring to stop. The road passed through a dry wash, the bottom littered with rocks and driftwood. I followed the tracks of a four-wheel drive vehicle that had come through recently. Whoever it was, they knew the road. Their tracks were confident, straight, never wavering. I followed them for miles until they turned off into a gully and disappeared. I stopped at the next overlook. The view was similar to the one I had seen the day before, but from a higher elevation. The White River was far below, and the forgotten highway was visible for miles, winding across the valley like a scar. I could see where the bridge had collapsed, a gap in the line of gravel. Beyond it, the road continued toward the horizon, curling up a mesa and then dropping out of sight. I felt a strange sense of accomplishment. I had crossed the broken bridge. I had made it this far, but the road was far from over. I spent the rest of the morning driving through the Badlands, stopping at every pull-off and historic marker. There were few of them, and most were faded and unreadable, but I found one at the base of a butte that commemorated the old highway. It was a bronze plaque bolted to a concrete post. The text was worn, but I could make out the words. This road, built in 1917, served as the primary route across the Badlands until the interstate highway system rendered it obsolete. It is a testament to the determination of the early settlers who carved a path through one of the most inhospitable landscapes in America. I touched the plaque and traced the letters with my finger. The metal was cold and smooth. I thought about the determination it took to build a road through this place. The men who surveyed the route had to walk every mile, carrying instruments and supplies. The construction crews worked with mules and hand tools, blasting through rock, building bridges over dry washes that would turn into torrents when the rains came. They slept in tents and ate beans and bacon. They faced heat and cold and wind and isolation. And they finished the road. It was not a masterpiece of engineering. It was raw and rough and dangerous, but it connected people. It gave them a way to move. By afternoon, I had reached the western terminus of the forgotten highway, where it met a modern country road. There was no sign, no monument, just a faded patch of pavement that gave way to gravel. I turned around and drove back the way I had come, but this time I took a different route, following a jeep trail that cut across the plains. The trail led to an abandoned farmhouse, its roof caved in, its windows empty. I got out and walked around. The house was built of wood and tar paper, the walls sagging, the porch steps rotten. A rusted plow sat in the yard, half buried in weeds. I found a child's shoe in the dirt, a small leather boot with the sole worn through. I wondered who had lived here. A family, probably. A mother and father and children who had tried to make a life in the Badlands. They had planted crops that the wind and drought killed. They had raised animals that the coyotes took. They had prayed for rain that never came. And then they had left, packing their belongings into a wagon and driving away down the very road I had just traveled. The house was all that remained. I sat on the porch steps and ate a sandwich, looking out at the empty fields. The wind was picking up and the clouds were building on the horizon. A storm was coming. I could feel it in the air, the pressure changing, the temperature dropping. The weather in the Badlands can turn violent in minutes. I had seen it before, the sudden wall of rain and hail, the flashes of lightning that set the prairie on fire. I did not want to be caught out here in a storm. I packed up and drove back toward the modern world. But as I drove, the sky darkened and the wind grew stronger. The first drops of rain hit my windshield. I turned east, looking for shelter. The road ahead was a blur of dust and water. The gravel turned to mud. I slowed down, but the car began to slide. I fought the wheel, trying to keep it straight. The rain came harder, pounding on the roof. I pulled over and waited. The storm raged for half an hour, and then as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The clouds broke and the sun came through, low and golden in the west. I got out and surveyed the damage. The road was a mess, deep ruts and standing water, but the car was fine. I continued east, and after a few miles, the gravel turned to pavement. I was back on the highway, the same highway I had left 2 days earlier. It felt strange to be on smooth, clean asphalt. The forgotten highway was behind me, hidden by the hills and the storm. I pulled into a small town called Martin, population 1,000. I found a motel and checked in. The room was small and clean, with a faded picture of the Badlands on the wall. I took a long shower and then lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling. The road was still in my mind. I could feel it, the memory of the gravel under my wheels, the walls of the canyon pressing in, the silence that was louder than any noise. I did not sleep well that night. I kept dreaming of the bridge, of the crack as the concrete gave way, of the river below. The next morning, I called my wife. She asked me where I was, and I told her. She said she was worried. I told her not to be. I told her I would be home in 2 days. Then I said something I had not planned. I told her I was going back. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I know. I have been expecting you to say that since you left." I hung up and packed my bag. I filled the gas tank and bought extra water and a few granola bars. I checked the map one last time. The old man at the gas station had drawn another line on the back, a dotted line that led to a place he called the lost town of Red Shale. He had said it was a ghost town, a settlement that had been abandoned in the 193s. No one knew exactly where it was. Some said it was just a story, a myth, but he had marked it on the map with a question mark. I decided to find it. I drove east out of Martin, then turned onto a dirt road that wound through the hills. The road was rough, barely a track. I followed it for miles, through canyons and over ridges. The sun was hot and the dust rose in clouds behind me. I stopped once to check the map, and I saw something curious. The dotted line crossed a wash that was not on the map. I drove down into the wash, and there, half buried in the sand, was a sign. It was old, wooden, with the letters painted in black. Red Shale, it said. Population 47. My heart raced. The town was real. I followed the sign, and after a few hundred yards, I saw the ruins. A row of stone foundations, a collapsed schoolhouse, a rusted water tower leaning at a precarious angle. I parked and got out. The silence was absolute. No birds, no wind, just the sound of my own footsteps on the dry earth. I walked through the ruins, imagining the lives that had been lived here. The children who had gone to that school, the families who had drawn water from that well, all gone now. The town was as forgotten as the highway itself. I found a marker at the edge of the town, a small plaque embedded in a rock. It read, "Red Shale was established in 1914 by settlers from Kansas and Nebraska. It was a farming community that relied on the highway for supplies and transport." The highway was abandoned in 1958. By 1963, all residents had left. This marker is dedicated to their memory. I sat down beside the marker and opened my last bottle of water. The sky was clear and blue, the sun starting to angle toward the horizon. I had found what I was looking for. I had connected with the ghosts of the Badlands, but I knew that this was not the end. The road was still out there waiting. And I would keep driving it in my sleep, in my dreams, until the day I finally returned. I rose and dusted off my pants. I walked back to the car and turned it around. The road back was easier, the track now familiar. I reached the modern highway as the sun set, painting the Badlands in shades of red and orange. I stopped one last time and looked back. The forgotten highway was lost in the glow, invisible but alive. I knew I would carry it with me forever. I sat there for a long time, letting the silence settle around me like a blanket. The sun was dipping lower, casting long shadows from the ruins. I could almost hear the echoes of the past, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the laughter of children, the creak of wagon wheels. But it was all gone, swallowed by the Badlands. I took a deep breath and stood up. The air smelled of dust and sage. I had found Red Shale, but I knew there was more to this story. The highway had not just connected towns, it had carried stories, dreams, and failures, and I was only beginning to understand them. I drove back to Martin as the last light faded. The motel room felt smaller than before, the walls closing in. I lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling, replaying the day in my mind. The sign, the ruins, the marker. I pulled out my notebook and wrote down everything I had seen. The names of the settlers, the dates, the details. I wanted to remember it all, but there was a gap, a missing piece. Why had the highway been abandoned so completely? The interstate system had bypassed it, sure, but other old roads survived as county routes or scenic drives. This one had been left to decay, forgotten even by the locals. There had to be a reason. The next morning, I decided to visit the local historical society. It was a small building on the edge of town, a converted church with a faded sign. I knocked on the door, and a woman in her 70s let me in. Her name was Martha, and she had lived in Martin her entire life. Her father had been a mail carrier on the old highway. She remembered riding with him as a girl, delivering letters to the ranches and farms that dotted the Badlands. She told me stories of the road, of the dust storms that buried cars, of the flash floods that washed out bridges. But she also told me something else, something that made my skin prickle. She said the road was cursed. Not in a supernatural way, she clarified, but in the way that it had taken so many lives. She pulled out a folder of newspaper clippings, yellowed and brittle. There were accounts of stagecoach robberies, of wagons falling into ravines, of families lost in blizzards. One clipping was from 1927 about a school bus that had slid off the road during a storm, killing 7 children. The community had never recovered. The road was rebuilt, but the tragedy seemed to follow it. More accidents, more deaths. People began to avoid it. They called it the Road of Sorrows. I listened, transfixed. Martha spoke in a low, steady voice as if she were telling a secret. She said her father had believed that the road had a kind of memory, that it remembered every life it had taken. He would not drive it after dark. He said the ghosts of the lost travelers could be heard on the wind, crying for help. I asked her if she believed it. She smiled and said she had never been on the road after dark herself, and she had no intention of changing that. I thanked Martha and left the Historical Society with a copy of a map she had made for me. It showed the locations of the worst accidents, marked with tiny crosses. There were dozens of them. I drove out of Martin and stopped at the first cross, a place called Deadman's Curve. It was a sharp bend on the old highway where the road cut through a narrow canyon. I got out and walked the curve. The pavement was cracked and overgrown. I could see skid marks on the rock walls, dark streaks that had been there for decades. I imagined the sound of tires screaming, the crunch of metal, the silence that followed. I spent the next 2 days following Martha's map. I visited every cross, every site of tragedy. At some I found remnants of the past, a twisted piece of metal, a rusted hubcap, a child's toy half buried in the dirt. At one site I found a small cross made of 2 pieces of wood tied with wire, faded and weathered. Someone had placed it there long ago and had kept coming back to tend it. There were fresh flowers at the base, a few wildflowers that must have been placed in the last week. I knelt down and touched the cross. It was rough and splintery. I wondered who had cared enough to keep the memory alive. That evening I called my wife again. I told her about the crosses, about the Road of Sorrows. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Are you sure you want to keep going?" I said I did not know, but I could not stop. The road was pulling me deeper. I had to understand why it had been forgotten. I had to find the truth buried in the Badlands. The next morning I drove to the county courthouse in the nearest larger town, a place called Kadoka. The records room was dusty and dim, the air heavy with the smell of old paper. I spent hours going through files, looking for anything about the highway. I found surveys, construction reports, and maintenance logs. But I also found a folder marked confidential. It was locked, but the clerk, an elderly man with a kind face, took pity on me. He said the folder contained documents from the 1950s when the highway was being decommissioned. He had no idea what was in it, but he had the key. He let me look at it in a private room. I opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside were letters, memos, and a single photograph. The letters were from a local rancher named James Hollister. He had written to the state highway department, begging them to keep the road open. He said that without it, his community would die. The memos were from the department, explaining that the road was too dangerous, too costly to maintain. They cited the accident rates, the geological instability, the erosion. But one memo stood out. It was from a geologist dated 1950. It said that the road was built on an ancient fault line. The entire area was slowly sinking. The ground was unstable. There was no way to fix it. I stared at the memo. The Badlands were sinking. It was not just erosion. The entire landscape was shifting, inch by inch, year by year. The road had been built on ground that was literally falling apart. That was why it had been abandoned. That was why it was so dangerous. The earth itself had rejected it. I looked at the photograph. It showed a group of men standing on a bridge, the same bridge I had walked across 2 days earlier. They were smiling, holding shovels and picks. The caption on the back said, "Completion of the North Fork Bridge, 1907. I turned the photo over and saw a handwritten note. "This bridge will last 100 years. The handwriting was confident, proud, but I knew the truth. The bridge was already cracking. The ground was giving way. The whole road was a monument to human folly. I left the courthouse with a heavy heart. I had found the answer, but it was not the one I had hoped for. The forgotten highway was not just a victim of progress. It was a failure, a mistake that had been erased from the landscape. The settlers who had built it had not known the ground would fail. They had believed in the future, in the power of human will, and they had been defeated by geology. I drove back to the road one last time. I wanted to see it with new eyes. I parked near the entrance, where the old sign still stood, barely readable. I walked a mile along the gravel, past the collapsed bridges and the washed-out culverts. I stopped at a spot where the road had split open, a deep crack running for hundreds of feet. I knelt down and looked into the crack. It was dark, the edges crumbled. I could see layers of rock, different colors, different ages. The history of the Badlands was written in those layers, and the road was just a scratch on the surface. I thought about James Hollister, the rancher who had fought to keep the road open. I thought about his family, his community, their hopes and dreams. They had all been swallowed by the sinking ground. The town of Red Shale was gone. The ranchers were gone. The road was gone. Only the Badlands remained, silent and patient, waiting for the next human folly. I stood up and brushed the dirt from my knees. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sand and sage. I looked out at the endless expanse of Badlands, the buttes and mesas, the canyons and washes. It was a harsh, unforgiving place. But it had its own beauty, a beauty that did not care about human roads or human sorrows. I walked back to my car and got in. I sat for a moment, the engine idling. I had come to the Badlands to find a forgotten highway. I had found a story of failure and loss, but I had also found a deeper truth. The road was not the only thing that had been forgotten. The people who built it, who lived and died along it, they had been forgotten too. Their names were on the maps, on the markers, but their lives were gone, erased by time and earth. I put the car in gear and drove away. I did not look back. I did not need to. The forgotten highway was in my mind, in my bones. I would carry it with me forever. But I also knew that I would never return. Some roads are meant to be traveled only once, and this one had given me everything it had. As I reached the modern highway, the headlights of a semi-truck flashed in my rearview mirror. I pulled over to let it pass, and it roared by, shaking my car with its wake. The driver did not see me. He did not see the turnoff to the old road. He was on his way to somewhere else, following the smooth, safe pavement of the interstate, and I was on my way home. It took me 2 days to get back. I called my wife every few hours, letting her know where I was. She did not ask about the road. She did not ask about the crosses or the sinking ground. She just said she would be waiting. And when I finally pulled into our driveway, she came out and hugged me. She did not say anything. She just held me. That night, I sat in my study and opened my notebook. The pages were filled with notes, maps, and sketches. I had documented every mile, every ruin, every story. I had tried to capture the road to make it real. But as I read through my own words, I realized that the road was not something I could capture. It was a ghost. It existed only in memory, in the fragments of history that remained, and my own memory would fade too, eventually. The road would be forgotten again. I closed the notebook and put it on the shelf. I turned off the light and sat in the darkness. The wind was blowing outside, rattling the windows. I thought about the Badlands, about the sinking ground, about the road of sorrows. I thought about the children on the school bus, the ranchers in their wagons, the men who built the bridge. They were all gone now. Somewhere out in the Badlands, their stories were still there, buried in the dust, waiting for someone else to find them. I did not sleep well that night. I dreamed of the road again. I was driving, the gravel crunching under my tires, the walls of the canyon closing in. I could hear the voices of the dead, whispering in the wind. They were calling my name. I woke with a start, my heart pounding. The room was dark and silent. I lay back and closed my eyes. The voices faded, but I knew they would come back. The next day, I went to the local library and checked out a book on the geology of the Badlands. I wanted to understand the forces that had destroyed the road. I read about the White River Group, the Brule Formation, the Chadron Formation. I learned about the ancient river systems, the volcanic ash, the erosion patterns. The Badlands were a graveyard of rock, a record of millions of years. The road had been a tiny scar on that record. And now even that scar was healing, as the earth reclaimed its own. I thought about the word forgot. It implies a lack of memory, a willful erasure. But the road had not been forgot. It had been absorbed. It was part of the Badlands now, just like the fossils and the bones. The highway was not a relic of the past. It was a lesson, a warning, a testament to human ambition and human failure. And as I read about the shifting strata and the collapsing cliffs, I understood that the road had never belonged to us. It had always belonged to the earth. Months passed. I went back to work, back to my routines. I stopped talking about the road. People stopped asking. The notebook stayed on the shelf, gathering dust. But sometimes, late at night, I would take it down and flip through the pages. I would look at the map Martha had given me with the tiny crosses marking the accidents. I would count them. There were 47, one for every soul lost. 47 ghosts riding the wind through the Badlands. And then one evening I got a call. It was Martha. She said she had found something I needed to see. She did not explain. She just said, "Come back." I booked a flight the next morning. I landed in Rapid City and drove south. The landscape was familiar now, the buttes and mesas like old friends. I reached Martin and found Martha at the Historical Society. She was holding a box. An old wooden box tied with string. She said her father had left it to her when he died. She had found it in the attic a week ago. She had not opened it until that morning. She handed it to me. It was light, but I felt its weight. I untied the string and lifted the lid. Inside were letters, dozens of letters tied in bundles. They were all addressed to James Hollister, the rancher who had fought to save the road. They were from his wife, his children, his friends. They were love letters, pleas for help, reports of hardship. The last letter was dated 1962. It was from James himself, written to his brother in California. He said, "The road is gone. The town is empty. We are leaving. I do not know where we will go, but I cannot stay. The ground is sinking under my feet." I read every letter. I sat in that small room, the afternoon sun streaming through the dusty windows, and I read the lives of a family who had tried and failed. Martha watched me in silence. When I finished, I looked up. Her eyes were wet. She said, "I think you should have these. They belong with someone who understands." I did not know what to say, so I just nodded. I took the box back to my motel room and set it on the table. I opened it again and pulled out a photograph I had not noticed before. It was James Hollister standing in front of his farm, his wife beside him, their children at their feet. They were smiling. Behind them, the Badlands stretched to the horizon. It was a hopeful picture, full of promise, and I knew that promise had been broken. I did not sleep that night. I sat and read the letters again and again. I listened to the voices of the dead. They were not crying. They were telling their stories, and I was the one who had to listen. The next morning, I drove back to the old road. I parked at the entrance and walked the mile to the cracked pavement. I carried the box with me. I found a spot near the split in the road where the earth had opened. I knelt down and placed the box in the crack. I said a silent prayer for James, for his family, for all the forgotten souls of the Badlands. Then I covered the box with dirt and stones. I left it there, buried in the road. I walked back to the car and got in. The wind was blowing, warm and dry. I looked at the road one last time. It was nothing but gravel and dust. But I saw it clearly now. It was not a road. It was a connection, a thread that tied the past to the present. And I had woven myself into that thread. I drove away without looking back, but I knew I would never really leave. The road was inside me now. It would stay there, sinking slowly into my memory until the day I myself became a ghost. And then maybe I would join the others, riding the wind through the Badlands, forever forgotten and forever remembered. That is the truth of the Forgotten Highway. It is not a place, it is a story, and stories never die. They just wait for someone to tell them. It has been 5 years since I last saw the old road. 5 years since I buried that box of letters in the crack of the earth. I have not returned. I do not plan to, but I think about it often, especially at night when the wind picks up and the house creaks. I have kept the photograph of James Hollister and his family. It sits on my desk, propped against a stack of books. Sometimes I look at it and wonder what became of them. Did they find a new home? Did the children grow up to be ranchers or teachers or soldiers? Did they ever speak of the road again? I will never know. And maybe that is the way it should be. I have given several talks about the Forgotten Highway, local historical societies, a few college classes, even a radio interview once. People are always intrigued by the idea of a road that vanished. They ask me what it felt like to drive it. They ask about the crosses and the stories. I tell them what I remember, but I always hold something back. I do not tell them about the voices I heard in the wind or the dream that still visits me now and then. I do not tell them that sometimes, when I close my eyes, I am still there, rolling down that gravel track, the sun beating down, the dust rising like a shroud. Some things are better left unsaid. I learned recently that the state is considering a proposal to stabilize the remaining fragments of the road. A group of historians and preservationists want to turn it into a walking trail with interpretive signs and a small parking lot. They say it would be a way to honor the memory of those who built it and those who lived along it. I signed the petition. I even wrote a letter of support, but I know in my heart that a trail is not the same as a road. A trail is a destination. A road is a journey. And the journey of that highway ended long ago. I still drive out to the Badlands every couple of years, not to the old road, but to other places. I visit the ghost towns and the abandoned homesteads. I walk the washes and the canyons. I find arrowheads and old bottles and fragments of bone. I always bring something back with me, a stone or a piece of rusted iron, and I put it on a shelf in my study. My wife says I am collecting ghosts. She is right. The other day, I took down the notebook from the shelf. The pages are yellowed now, the ink faded. I opened it and read my own words, written so long ago. I was surprised by how young I sounded, how eager to find meaning in every broken thing. I closed the book and put it back. I am older now. I know that meaning is not something you find. It is something you make, and then you leave behind for someone else to make their own. I think about Martha sometimes. She moved away a few years after my visit. She went to live with her daughter in Oregon. I have not heard from her since. I hope she is at peace. I hope she knows that her father's letters found a resting place. I hope the earth that swallowed them keeps them safe. And I think about the children on the school bus, the ones who died on that bridge. Their names are carved in the stone monument near the entrance of the road. I have seen it. The letters are worn but still legible. Mary, age 7, Thomas, age 9, Elizabeth, age 6. They are the youngest ghosts of the Badlands. They never had a chance to grow old, to forget, to be forgotten. They are frozen in time, forever riding that bus towards something that would never come. I do not know what happens after we die. I am not a religious man, but I believe in stories. And I believe that a story once told never truly ends. It changes, it grows, it becomes part of other stories. The Forgotten Highway is now a story inside me, and when I am gone, it will become a story inside someone else. Perhaps you, perhaps the person who hears this episode. Perhaps a stranger walking through the Badlands 100 years from now, kicking up dust and wondering what lies beneath. The road is still there. It is buried, broken, covered in grass and stone, but it is there. And as long as one person remembers it, it is not forgotten. I am that person now, but I will not be forever. So I am telling you this so you can carry it with you, and you can tell someone else. And so it goes, like the wind that never stops blowing across the Badlands, carrying the whispers of the dead. I have said everything I needed to say. The notebook is back on the shelf. The photograph is still on the desk. The wind is blowing outside, rattling the trees. I am going to make a cup of tea and sit in the dark. I will think of James Hollister and his smiling family. I will think of the bridge and the bus and the crosses. I will think of the road, winding through the Badlands, waiting for someone to find it again. And maybe someday someone will.